Welcome to the Biomedical Engineering Society Professional Development Webinar, Design Standards for Biomedical Engineering. I'm Donald Gaver from Tulane University, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm the Alden J Dhokla Board Professor and Chair of the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Tulane University, and I also serve as the Chair of the Biomedical Engineering Society Education Committee. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping rules I'd like to tell you about. First, this webinar is being recorded for your convenience. The slides and archived recording will be available in the next several days through the BMES website on the e-learning page. Next, at any time during the webinar, please submit questions by using the online chat function to the lower left of your screen. Please submit your questions as we go. Your questions will be addressed by the speakers at the end of the webinar. Lastly, please do not exit the webinar right at the end because there will be a brief evaluation. We'd greatly appreciate your feedback to make these webinars better. So please take your moment to complete it. We'd like to begin with a couple polling questions. And the first is, which of the following best describes you? Are you a student, postdoctoral fellow, faculty member, industry professional, or other? I'll give you about 30 seconds to complete that question. Okay, that's great. I can see that most of you are faculty members, a couple students, one industry professional, and one postdoctoral fellow. Our next question is about your program. Can you tell me whether you are not yet accredited, accredited, or coming up for accreditation in the next 3 years? Okay, that's great. I can see that most of you are accredited, 17 are accredited, 3 are not yet accredited, and 3 are up for accreditation in the next several years. Okay, let's move forward with our presentation. The first presentation is by Jay Goldberg. He is a PhD and a professional engineer. He's a clinical professor of biomedical engineering at the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Marquette University. He's the director of a healthcare technologies management program. It's a graduate management program that prepares engineers for advancement into management positions in medical device companies, hospitals, or healthcare consultation firms. He teaches a senior capstone design course and courses on needs finding and managing the product development process for medical devices. He's worked in the medical device industry for 14 years prior to joining Marquette back in 1999. He worked for Dupuis, Baxter, Surgitech, and Milestone Scientific. And he writes a column on senior design for IEEE EMBS Pulse magazine. Okay, Jay.
Okay, thanks, Don. So first I'd like to start out with just sharing with you some of my experience with standards themselves. I got originally exposed to standards through some standards development activities. When I worked for Surgitech, that was a urological device company, and what happened was a urologist contacted ASTM, and ASTM is the American Society for Testing in Materials. He contacted them to request the creation of a standard for ureteral stents, and I've included some graphics on the right side. In the upper right is what a typical ureteral stent looks like, and in the bottom right just shows you where the stent is placed in the body. It sits between the kidney and the bladder, and it fills the space in the ureter, and it allows urinary drainage from the kidney to the bladder. So there were about 5 or 6 companies that made ureteral stents, and this urologist was concerned because every company seemed to test their ureteral stents differently, which made comparison between products very difficult because you couldn't compare apples to apples because different test procedures were being used. And it led to some confusion. Companies were measuring the lengths differently. So he said, you know, we need a standard. So I was familiar with ASTM, and I volunteered to become the chair of this ASTM task group on ureteral stents. and I was working for a company. We were the market leaders in ureteral stents. And it took us about 5 years, but we ended up developing a new standard, which was approved in about 1995 for this product, the ureteral stents. And then I continued as a member of chairing the ASTM committee on all urological devices, which included ureteral stents and Foley catheters. My experience with standards in industry involved using this ureteral stent standard that we developed, because any of those new stents that we developed were tested per the procedures in that standard. Then when I worked for Milestone Scientific, we made dental products. It was a dental startup company, and I became very familiar with not product standards but system standards and things like that. For example, ISO 9001. I helped create a quality system for the company that was compliant with the FDA quality systems regulations and the ISO 9001. We ended up getting a CE mark for our dental products, which required compliance with lots of different ISO standards, things like risk management, biocompatibility testing, and others. And then my experience with design education, standards in design education, comes mainly from a 2-semester capstone design course that I teach. And this is for a mix of different engineering students. But in that course, we talk about the role and the value of standards in the design process, how standards are developed, and what the career benefits are of becoming involved in standards development activities. So what are the value of standards? Why is it important for students to learn about it? Well, they benefit medical device manufacturers and biomedical engineers themselves, because they contain requirements that are needed that impact design and testing. They list the specs all in one place, which saves time and confusion trying to gather specifications and test procedures from different sources. And a lot of companies will not buy your product unless you comply with certain standards, so it's very helpful to the company that way. Considering standards early in the design phase can avoid costly design changes and scheduling delays later. The last thing that capstone design students or even engineers in industry want to hear is when they're a month from introducing the product or a month from finishing the course, that they learn of a particular standard they need to comply with. So looking at these things early can really help, and standards are very helpful that way. For consumers, it ensures compatibility and interchangeability of products that are made by different companies. It basically protects the health, safety, and welfare of the public. And then capstone design teams, the value of standards to these teams is it helps identify these design constraints early in the project. Standards often include test procedures that have been developed and validated by industry experts, so there's no need to reinvent the wheel and have students develop their own test procedures. And also, a familiarity with standards helps prepare students for professional practice. So when they get into the workforce, they understand what standards are, how to work with them, how to access them, that kind of thing. At Marquette University, where I teach, in our capstone design course, we follow pretty much all the phases that are described in ISO 9001, the Quality Management System Standard, and ISO 13485, which is basically medical device quality systems. And we have a set of course deliverables that match up very nicely with all the sections of design controls in these standards. And Bob Hitchcock will talk a little more about that because he did a lot of this in his course. You'll hear about that in a few minutes. I just want to show a couple examples. We have several deliverables that are required in the course. The first, and here's just 2 examples. Our customer needs and target product specs. When the students generate this in the first semester, they're required to conduct a standard search because, as I mentioned before, April or May is not the time to find out you need to comply with the standard. So our students are told to ask their project sponsors about any standards that they might need to comply with. And for our experimental verification deliverable document, all of our teams develop prototypes around February, March, and they begin testing them to complete the design verification phase. And we encourage them to take a look at standards because instead of them inventing their own new test procedures, these procedures may have already been developed and described in standards, and they can save a lot of time if they can if they can follow those test procedures. So what do students learn about standards? At the end of the course, they learn, first, a lot of them will say, these standards really save me a lot of time. They learn that standards describe a set of technically valid industry-approved test procedures. They allow for direct comparison between competitive products. As long as the products are tested using the same procedure, you can compare apples to apples. And it's easy to make claims that your product is better than your competitors if everybody's testing it the same way. And they learn that there's benefits not only to their design projects while they're students, but also to future projects in industry. And another thing that they learn, I share my standards development experience with students, and they learned that this is a very good professional development activity to get involved with. After they've been working for a few years, companies really like having one of their employees as part of a standards committee, because in effect it allows the company to have input into this standard that they're going to have to comply with. It gives students a better understanding of the industry itself, and it also provides them with some exposure in the industry, because they will work on teams with people from their competitors, and this helps with networking and visibility within industry. So one of the examples that I use to try to illustrate the importance of standards to students, because standards is, let's face it, it's not a very exciting topic. It can be dry at times, but to try to drive home the importance of standards, I usually share this example with them. And this is ISO 594. This is basically a standard for what's commonly referred to as a Luer fitting. You'll see some syringes and needles, and they comply with the spec on the Luer fittings. And what it allows is compatibility. I can take a syringe manufactured by one company and a needle manufactured by another, and if they comply with this standard, I know that the parts are going to fit. So if a surgeon needs to inject something in an emergency situation, he or she doesn't have to worry about getting the right parts that fit. If they all comply with the standard, they're going to fit, they're going to be compatible, and that improves patient safety. So the last thing I want to talk about is access to standards and resources for educators, resources for all of you and me. For ASTM International, they have a program called Standards on Campus. And what happens here is that a faculty member will register his or her course online. There's no charge to do that. And then they can select up to 10 standards to use in their courses. Then the students can download those for $10. So basically it's $1 a standards. It makes it very, very affordable. Also, when students do this, they receive a free student membership in ASTM International. So there's lots of benefits to this program. It makes it easier for you to use standards in your course and for your students to access them. They also provide project grants, $500 to student teams or students to help them. If they do a project that involves an ASTM International standard, then they can get this grant. And then at the bottom there it says Professor's Toolkit. This is a DVD that has lots of really good information and presentations you can give in class about standards if you want, and it's available free at the ASTM website. Okay, the next one is IEEE, Standards University. They have a program that provides standards education content and resources. The next slide actually gives a little more detail on that. So here's some websites you can visit to, I'll point out practical ideas from professors. These are articles written by fellow practitioners who have, it talks about what they do, what methods they use to teach standards in their courses. And this isn't just limited to capstone design. That's, I think, typically where standards are talked about, but they also can be used and talked about earlier in the curriculum in different courses. And there's a website there for learning about how to access the standards at an affordable price. So there are lots of resources there for you regarding accessibility of standards.
Thanks so much, Jay. We'll now move on to our next speaker, which is Bob Hitchcock. Bob is an associate professor, and he's the graduate chair of the Department of Bioengineering at the University of Utah. Bob is the director of the Utah Biodesign Program, which is a 2-semester medical device design program for undergraduate and graduate bioengineering students that focuses on FDA-mandated requirements for medical device design. He's worked in the medical device industry for 20 years prior to joining the University of Utah in 2006. Several of the companies he's worked for are Becton Dickinson, Medtronic, Utah Sorensen Medical, and he also co-founded Catheter Connections in 2008. Before we move on to Bob, I'd like to ask you all to please submit questions. And now, Bob, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Don. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to take a slightly different tack from Jay and talk about standards, design standards as they relate to mandated FDA requirements for designing and developing medical devices that are used in the United States and subsequently worldwide. We're going to focus on the domestic standards. So, as we know, anytime you develop a medical device, and on this slide you can see a handheld ambulatory infusion pump that I was involved with developing about a dozen years ago. And surrounding that and all the bubbles are all of the different regulatory agencies that have something to say about this infusion pump. So whether it's the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office or International Standards Organization, the European Union, we're going to focus on the Food and Drug Administration. So when we teach design, we introduce this concept to our students through the FDA. And so the FDA has their quality system requirements. And this, quite frankly, is the law. We have to follow these standards, and it's done in industry. It's done in all medical device companies. And so this is what we require from our students as we teach this, and this is really the overriding standard that is used for designing and developing medical devices. So it comes from the U.S. Code, and the U.S. Code, it comes from Title 21, and Title 21, we can see the U.S. Code consists of 50 different titles. It's sort of a how-to guide for running your country, but Title 21 is Food and Drugs, and it is focused on the Food and Drug Administration. Within Title 21, there are a number of different parts, and these are just some examples of the different parts that might be involved in developing medical devices. We focus on Part 820. So this consists of 15 subparts and 31 sections. And, you know, it's sort of interesting. The students think they're going into a design class at this point, and they're all ready to design stuff, and we hit them up with all these regulations. The one that we focus on within 21 CFR 820 is the one that's in the box on the slide in front of you, and that's design controls. This is really, from an engineering perspective, and certainly from a design perspective, the most important regulatory standard that the students need to learn. There are 10 paragraphs of the 820.30 design controls, and they're listed here, A through J, so you can see their general provisions. You get into planning, design input, design output, review, verification, validation, transfer, changes, and design history files. So we have taken all of these design control elements and formulated our own standard operating procedures. And so what we do is we have the students follow the standard operating procedures, and it really mirrors the best case in industry. So all medical device companies have to follow design control, yet the federal code is actually pretty thin and describes these standards at a very high level. And that's actually good because it allows each entity to come up with their own standard operating procedures depending on the types of products they develop and the types of customers that they're servicing. So we get involved with general provisions. We have the students develop a design and development plan. Design input consists of their design requirements. Design output are the specifications and prototypes. We conduct a series of design reviews, and it's interesting that these design reviews are important milestones for the students, and they get graded on this. Design verification are the test protocols that they develop to ensure that the design output is meeting the design input. and those are typically bench tests. We do not get involved with design validation because quite often those are very expensive biocompatibility tests, animal testing, human clinical testing, but we teach them about that. It's just not something we do in our design course. Design transfer is moving the design from a design and development environment into a production environment, and that's also something that we address but we don't do in our course. Design changes, of course, all the documentation that they develop are revision controlled and signed off, so we do adhere to that, and they put all of this together in order to make a comprehensive design history file. So design control is really a great way to teach design because it's systematic, and it allows organizations, not only medical device companies, but also academic institutions to develop processes to meet their own needs. It's team-based, so multidisciplinary teams can take on a lot of different personalities depending on the type of product that you're developing, and we see that our students will often take on different roles as team leaders, or maybe somebody puts the marketing hat on for a while, or somebody is the software developer and somebody's a mechanical engineer, materials. I think one of the most important parts is that it's customer focused, and so all of our projects, we're very fortunate to have a medical school associated with us at the University of Utah, and so all of the ideas come from unmet needs in our hospital clinics, and so there's always a clinician mentor associated with the teams, and so they get to work with the folks in the clinic in order to derive requirements that then subsequently play a key role in driving specifications and ultimately validation. It's a very robust process because of these two feedback loops that are involved, and those feedback loops are verification and validation, ensuring that what you're producing was what the customer required or the patient or the doctor required in the first place. And then finally, it's required by law. It's federal law that all medical devices be designed using these standards. So, you know, it really raises an interesting question about what is a medical device. And so this is what we teach our students, and this comes from the federal government. So it's defined here as something that is either in the national formulary and or is intended for the use in the diagnosis, treatment, mitigation, prevention of disease in man, animals, or it's intended to affect the structure by lots of means that do not achieve their primary means through chemical action or through metabolism. And a great example is, one of my favorites is popsicle stick or tongue depressor, right? They're both the same thing. They both have to be clean and in some cases sterile. They both go in your mouth. They both have to be safe, and quite often they're made from the same trees and in the same factories. But a tongue depressor is a medical device. Why? Because it's recognized in the national formulary. So if you go to subpart G, section 880.6230, they define what a tongue depressor is. And so that, by its very nature, defines it as a medical device. And you can see on this slide, it's a class 1 device. So we have class 1, 2, and 3 devices, and we're not going to get into that here. So these are the design control standards. There is one other standard that we teach in our class that I think is very important and is probably one of the most important elements of design standards and design control, and that's risk management. So the FDA does not have a lot to say, surprisingly, about risk management. ISO has a lot to say about risk management, and I'll try to go through this for you. So there is a guidance document that the Food and Drug Administration puts out. It's their Quality System Regulation Guidance document, and on both page 5 and on page 33, they describe risk management. So here it is on page 5. They say it's a systematic application of management policies and procedures. It's intended to be a framework, and that it's an ongoing part of the design and development process. It's a really interesting and very important aspect of design standards to teach our students, because it provides a really nice lens for them to look at the design and understand how it can be misused or how it can cause harm, and for them to mitigate that potential harm through their design. Another interesting aspect is that in the actual design control itself, so if you look in the Federal Code, sections A through J, those 10 parts, there's only one place where risk comes, where you can even find the word risk, and it's here in paragraph G under design validation. And so you can see in the fourth bullet point down, it states that design validation shall include software validation and risk analysis where appropriate. But we do know that the FDA takes a very close look at risk analysis, and they consider it to be an important part of the design history file. The standard that drives risk assessment is ISO 14971, and it is being revised right now. There are some changes, but quite simply, the way that we teach this to our students is that there are two elements of risk, likelihood and severity. There's actually a third way that you can look at it, and that's probability of detection. But from a teaching perspective, this keeps it simple and the students understand it. So what we do is we can look at the function of a device, and we can look at what is the severity if it doesn't provide that function, and what's the likelihood of it occurring. And we multiply those two together in order to come up with a risk acceptance number. And the goal is to be less than 19. And so severity assessment consists of things like rating of 10, which would be catastrophic, potential multiple deaths. Maybe you're developing an anesthesia machine that uses a flammable gas, and if it were to blow up in the operating room, there could be multiple deaths, or even some drugs. If you're operating machinery or bathing an infant, there could be potential multiple deaths, all the way down to negligible, that there's no noticeable effect by the consumer. It's interesting that using these criteria, that the potential of total loss of function, treatment, or diagnosis is considered a major severity. And so you take this and you multiply it by the likelihood of occurrence, and it's often very difficult for the students to wrap their minds around, how do I calculate likelihood of occurrence? It's easier for companies because they have some idea, but we provide them with some guidance so that they can come up with a number, and then they put a table together of all the different functions of the device and all the different failure modes. So we teach this in failure modes effects analysis and fault tree analysis, and then they're required to mitigate the high risks through their design. So those two elements, design control and risk analysis, we teach very aggressively in our class, and the feedback that we get from the industry professionals that hire our students in the medical device industry is that this is plenty of, that this is the type of information that they would like them to have. So I'm just going to conclude here by saying that teaching standards teaches the best practice. When students go into their job interview, if they're going to go into the medical device, industry, the hiring managers will often look at their senior projects and say, yeah, that's nice, but they're the ones that really do a high-level job of developing projects. If the students can go in there and talk about design control and ISO standards like Jay talked about, ISO 594, which is the Cellular standard, or risk assessment according to ISO standards, that really impresses the hiring managers because it really is the best practice in industry. Medical device design requirements are mandated in the US, EU, and most other countries that purchase and consume medical products. There are also professional skills that easily translate to the workplace. So once the students understand the mindset of design control and the basic elements of design input, design output, design planning, design reviews, design history files, how to document changes, how to come up with revision control documents, and how to do risk assessment, those are skills that easily translate into the workplace. And I believe, and we've been doing this for almost 10 years now in our capstone design, senior design, and biomedical engineering, that it really synchronizes very well with the capstone design process. And with that, I will thank you very much for your attention and be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Bob. This is Don Gaver once again as the moderator. We now have time for questions. I'm sure there are plenty out there, so if you've got any, please send those through the chat function. I'm going to start with the first question that I'm going to ask Jay, which is, how do you introduce these regulations, by assignment or by lecture?
Okay. Well, in our capstone design course, we try to minimize outside assignments other than reading of some chapters of a design textbook. So we don't do it by assignment, but we have a guest lecturer. We use a lot of guest lecturers in our course. And I have a guest lecturer that comes in from, well, he used to work for Underwriters Laboratories. He's got a lot of standards background, and he basically talks about ISO 9001. And I agree with what Bob said, that if I had to pick, there's so many standards out there, international standards, if I had to pick one, that we only had time to cover one, I would say ISO 9001 because it is just so pervasive. And we talk about the design control section, and so the speaker talks to the students about what's in the section, what each section of the design controls means in terms of how it would impact an engineer's role in a company. How would it impact the job that you're doing. And so that's how they learn about this. And then, as I mentioned before, and just kind of want to make an overall comment, I would bet money that most of the people listening to this webinar and most capstone design instructors are actually complying. Their course does teach a lot about ISO 9001, but they may not realize it. For most of the capstone design courses around the country, I just came back from the Capstone Design Conference, and most of us do require students to come up with a list of customer needs. And we call it customer needs. GE Healthcare calls it voice of the customer, but the design standards section calls it design input. So design output is the final report with all the specifications and the design. Even the design history file is another name for a project notebook. We have our students, keep a project notebook, which is a form of a design history file. We also have them do test procedures to show that they've met the original specifications. We call that experimental verification, and there's a section on design verification and validation. So I think a lot of instructors are really already requiring things that comply with ISO 9001, but they're just not aware of it. So as far as assignment or lectures, we use the lecture approach. We have a presenter that comes in and talks about this. And he also talks about, there's some other international standards too. He talks about all the standards that he thinks during their career they will be exposed to. So we take the lecture approach to teach the students about the standards.
Thanks, Jay. I'm going to follow this up with another question that's related to students and standards. What do you do if a student is hesitant to follow a standard? For example, if they feel like it's an illogical standard, do you encourage them to reassess that, or what's the process of working with students in that kind of case for either one of you?
Okay, well, I can just very quickly respond to that. I've never had that come up, but if someone does say, we don't think this applies, that's okay, because our course, we're not, unless there's an industry sponsor that says, I absolutely need this design to comply with standard XYZ, I would talk to the student and find out why. Sometimes the standards require certain test procedures that we don't have the equipment for. So in that case, we might make an exception and say, okay, at least you're aware of the standard, you know what it requires, but if we don't have the facilities to comply with it, then make a note of that in your final report.
Yeah, let me add something there, Don. I think that there are a lot of standards that seem very ambiguous to the students, but the fact is that these standards, they come from legitimate organizations, and they've been written by experts, and they've been reviewed and edited and revised. And so I think it's our job, if the students feel that they're illogical, then it's our job as educators to make sure that we help to explain that to the students. There are oftentimes, as Jay mentioned, there are parts of the standards that are not relevant for whatever reason. But I think that working with the students to take a holistic perspective of why the standard is there and what portion of it may be applicable to their needs is our role as educators.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I could imagine there could be unintended consequences that could happen if you don't follow standards, and that they should be aware of that as well.
Well, yeah, I'm tempted to say that there are a lot of standards that I follow, like tax law, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But it doesn't mean that I get to walk away from it.
And one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these standards they're voluntary, but if you want to sell your product, you have to comply with them. So if you want to sell your product, they're not really voluntary. So it is important for students, if there's a standard, to do their best to try to comply with it.
Okay, great. Here's a related question: is how do you record a student's compliance with standards, and do you think that's important, for example, for documentation with accreditation?
I'll answer that one first. So we believe that the best standard for our students to adhere to is the design control standards, and we've developed our own standard operating procedures that they have to follow in our class. Many of the elements in each one of those SOPs are essential. Some of them are desirable. We understand that there are a number of standards, whether they're ISO standards or IEC standards, that are really not approachable by the students. We want the students, so for example, ISO 10993, which is biocompatibility, we don't have our students perform biocompatibility assessment, but we sure want them to tell us what tissue is contacted, what the duration of contact is, and what types of tests need to be run. So I think that it's much more important for the students to acknowledge and to a certain extent understand what the standards are, and in most cases it's not very realistic for them to actually adhere to them, other than in our biodesign program at the highest level, the design control standards.
And I would say we take the same approach. What Bob described, we take a similar approach. We have guidelines and rubrics for each of the deliverables, and by completing all these deliverables, they are in effect complying with ISO 9001, and that's information, these deliverables, we can show to an ABET auditor to show that they are complying with the standard.
Very good. Okay, I'm going to ask a different question that's related to the examples of documentation. So the question is, do you give your students an example of design-controlled documents and DHFs from industry? Do you have some good resources for this kind of information? Either one of you.
So what we do is we give them occasionally an example. You know, the ones in industry tend to be quite a bit more exhaustive than the ones that they're developing in our classroom. And what we do is we actually allow them to take a look at what we believe are outstanding examples of design history files from student teams in previous years.
Yeah, and we take a similar approach. I don't have examples of documents in industry. A lot of them are proprietary anyway, and some of the companies would hesitate to share those with the students. But we do we do document, what they're doing. We use the rubrics and the guidelines to verify that they are, complying with these things.
Okay. So a little change of pace here. How much do you all go into biocompatibility and sterilization? Do they learn these before or in the design course?
Well, I think that's a great question because those are two key elements that will are associated with just about every single medical device that you're going to design and develop. And so we require them to come up with the requirements for sterilization. So typically, they will tell us what the sterilization assurance level should be, and they will also explain and they'll identify and explain the type of sterilization that's being used, and then during the design control or during the design review, we'll actually query them and say, you know, if you're going to be using gamma sterilization but you have an electronic circuit, how is that going to affect it? Or what type of packaging are you going to use if you're going to use ethylene oxide sterilization? So we do not have them do sterilization because it's outside of the scope of the class, but they need to design the package and the label and the product in accordance with the type of sterilization that they're going to do. As far as biocompatibility, they need to acknowledge ISO 10993, and they need to describe in detail the type of testing that's done. Now, it's pretty straightforward. ISO 10993 gives us a lookup table that explains exactly the type of biocompatibility testing that needs to be done based on the type of tissue that's contacted and the duration of contact. And that's what we want them to understand. We don't perform biocompatibility testing in our class.
And we don't do that either. I agree with Bob. It's beyond the scope of the course. It's very expensive. It can be very time-consuming, depending on the level of invasiveness and the duration and that kind of thing. But what we do talk about is we do have some lectures that I give on biocompatibility. I show the standard. I show that lookup table and explain, why a heart valve requires more testing than a Band-Aid. Also, sterilization and packaging. That's something that a lot of programs don't talk about, but again, we do this by lecture, showing the different methods of sterilization and the effects they have on materials and how it can impact your material choice for your product, and also talk about package testing. And there is an ASTM standard on package testing, which I refer to, and I have some nice images that showing the different types of packaging tests that are done, what can happen if you don't test properly, those kinds of things. But we don't require students to actually do package design or testing. There's only so much you can do in the course, and that's something. We just want to make them aware that this is a requirement. This is something you're going to have to deal with when you get into industry, but we don't actually require that as part of our course or the project.
Very good. One of our participants was wondering whether you have examples of standards for cellular molecular projects. She finds that students working with living cells or molecular biology processes are frustrated when identifying relevant standards. Can either of you address that question?
If you look, I don't know offhand, but if you look in its ASTM and it's section or volume 13.0 for its medical devices, there are standards that talk about how to deal with tissues, and I know maybe for a totally different purpose, I don't know, but it's certainly worth looking up on their website to see if they have any standards that relate to molecular type, tissue engineering type projects.
Yeah, and we don't deal with that at all. We're strictly in the medical device space. Sometimes we deal with combination devices, and there's some regulations about those, but we don't do any in vitro diagnostics, and most of the stuff is covered by 820.30.
Yeah. Okay. I've got two questions that I believe are linked, and I think they're for Jay. And the first is, how can you apply for the $500 grant? And is a reasonably priced 10-pack enough to support a large course for which each team wants the standards appropriate for a particular project? What do you do when one standard is a short document that points to other detailed standards?
Oh yeah, good point. Yeah, that last comment's a good point, because sometimes one standard will reference another, and that one might reference yet another. So, okay, so let me answer the first one, the project grants from ASTM. I'm looking at a spec sheet they sent me, and the best thing to do is to go to their website, which is astm.org, and there's probably a section on standards education, And if you hit the tab that says Project Grants, there's a page that describes this. And so basically, it says here that the deadline for project grant applications is October 31st, and there's just a few items that you need to provide to them. So it looks like a very simple application process. But I think the best thing to do is just go to the astm.org website and try to navigate through it to find out information on the project grants. Okay, so the second question was about if you get 10 standards, is that enough? You know, it's hard for me to answer because it depends on the product. You know, some standards will tell you to, let's say if it's a tubular device, they might say do some type of a tensile test, but they don't necessarily describe the tensile test procedure in that standard. They may refer you to another standard. So that may be why they've grouped them in 10, because they realize that maybe it's hard to do the job with just one standard. But you know, $1 a standard is really inexpensive. Some of these standards can be, you know, over $100 each. So $1 a standard is pretty good. And so I guess it's hard for me to answer the question without knowing the specific project. But I would think that 10 standards would be enough to cover what a team might need.
Okay, I think this is a related question. It is beyond 21 CFR 820 or ISO 9001, how do you direct students to search for standards that might be specifically related to their project? For example, ISO 594.
Yeah. You know, it's another great question, and I think it really speaks to our dedication as teachers to teach design. It's a very labor-intensive process, and we have to use our experience in order to guide students toward this. Students are exceptionally good at getting on Google and searching all over the internet for all sorts of information, but when we have mentors who come in from industry, or if we have industrial experience, we shepherd the students in the right direction to identify those standards. It's not an easy thing to do, and there's no catalog that you can go to, and no clearinghouse that you can go to identify all of the standards for each device. So it requires a little bit of detective work and experience, and I think that we need to work with the students on a team-by-team or case-by-case basis in order to do that.
Right, and I would add to that yes, students are adept at Google searches, and that's what I recommend students do. But they could also, we have a lot of corporate-sponsored, industry-sponsored projects, and we tell them to have a conversation with your corporate sponsor, because they know what standards they need this design to comply with. So they may be able to tell you right from the beginning, these are the standards it needs to comply with. So that's one source. But for projects that don't have an industry sponsor, I suggest they do a Google search. Also, go to the different standard organizations' websites and search those, like ASTM is one of them. And another one I'd like to share is it's AAMI, AAMI. It's the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation. And they have lots of standards there for electronic, medical instrumentation. They also have standards for sterilization, human factors, lots of different standards that ASTM might not have. And also you can go to the ISO website too. Another organization is IEC, International, I can't remember what it stands for, but a lot of electronics types device standards, things like leakage testing, current leakage testing, things like that. So but I would agree with Bob. Doing a search on Google is probably the best first step.
Okay, great. A very quick question. One participant asked, if the university already has access or a subscription to standards, is there any benefit to paying $10 for 10 standards?
No, and if you go to the ASTM website, that's one of the things that they'll tell you. If your university already has an access, then you should be able to get the standards for free. And I think there's a way students can too, and if they can't, then the faculty members can at least get it for them if they have this subscription. So then there would be no need to do this $10 for 10 standards program.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question about a standards issue, and then some on to managing courses and resources. So the last one about standards is once a student has some experience with a standard or as an idea, how do you teach them how to read a standard and determine if it applies to the device they are developing?
Yeah. I think how to read a standard is pretty straightforward. At least I'm most familiar with the ASTM standards, and they're broken down by section very logically, defining certain terminology. And there are some standards there's product standards, there's testing standards. There's even I found a standard that it's just about, I think it says standard terminology for surgical scissors, and it's basically a standard that defines how you should refer to the parts of the surgical scissors. It doesn't have any test procedures in it. It doesn't talk about materials and nothing like that. So standards, they're very different. But reading through them, I find is pretty logical. Probably a good idea would be to show, in my class, I show the pages of the standard that I helped develop because I'm the most familiar with that, and show them how it flows logically and how they can use these to identify test procedures and things like that. So I don't think that should be a problem. And then the second part, how do you know if it applies to your project? Again, it just depends on the standard, excuse me, and what your project is about. There are lots of medical devices where there are no standards. So that's another thing people should keep in mind, that there aren't standards for everything. So after they do a search, if they can't find it, if it's kind of a newer type of product and the standard wasn't developed, then they're not going to find a standard for it. They may find a test procedure that they could use in testing that product, their prototype, but not every medical device has a standard developed for it.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions now, and they're interrelated. It's going to be a little bit of a buckshot approach towards these questions. So both of you, I hope, will have answers towards this. It relates to how you teach this course. One of the questions is, in your design course, how many projects do you have at a time? Are the projects in the same technical field? And a related question was, how do you manage the different technical aspects of these types of questions or types of projects?
Yeah, another good question, Don. So we have about 80 students and four students per team on average. So we manage about 20 projects. There are 4 lab sections that happen every week, and it's a very hands-on type process. So
how many staff members do you have working with them?
Well, let's see. We have myself and 2 other instructors, a laboratory engineer, and a TA. So there are about 5 of us. So we also bring in some guest lectures occasionally, but that's it. So we require that the TA and the lab engineer be in the lab for each session, and then one of the instructors, so myself or the 2 instructors, one of us is there for each of the lab sections, and we have a team teaching meeting every week, which is really just a management meeting so that we can take a look forward, we can do some planning, we can make sure that everything's covered. As far as the technical differences, we're working on essentially original ideas that come from clinical needs at the University of Utah Hospital, and all the projects are different. Some of them are very straightforward, a new type of injection needle for ocular injections. Others are quite a bit more complicated. And one of the great things about this class is that I get to learn about all sorts of new medical technology. I teach the process of medical device design and development, and I've got enough experience that I can help them with technical issues. But quite frankly, I end up learning a lot about the medical technology, the application from the students, and it's really a great environment for me to learn as well. The way that we level the playing field, though, because we grade the students essentially by auditing them with their ability to follow the standard operating procedures that we have, and then of course on the quality of their work and on exams and tests. But we require that each each project have what we call a prototype element. And the number of prototype elements are equivalent to the number of people on the team. So if we have a 3-person team, there are 3 elements, 5-person team, 5, 4, 4. And then we grade, we focus on those elements. So those elements should be that special sauce that allows the project to work, and we require that one of the prototype elements be a human factors element, where somebody's interacting with it, and so we can bring in some ergonomics and human factors into the design as well. And so we're not necessarily technical experts on every single project, but we are experts on the design and development process.
Yeah, yeah. And I similar at Marquette, my expertise is in the process, and my PhD research was in the materials area, but not every project involves that. So we have our course combines 4 different engineering disciplines, and we have 40 projects. About 18 of them are biomedical engineering projects last year that I was responsible for. But I rely on, we have faculty members in our department that advise each of these teams, and they're the ones that have the technical expertise. My background's not software, so I wouldn't advise a software development project, but we have faculty members that can do that. We also we're about 15 minutes from the Medical College of Wisconsin, and we do have access to clinical experts that can talk to the students about procedures and the steps and what they need and that kind of thing. Our projects are probably 1/3 are industry sponsored. Then the rest of them are either service learning projects like devices for developing nations, assistive technology projects for people with disabilities, and student-generated projects. They have an idea they may want to commercialize someday. So on a lot of these there aren't standards for because they're kind of cutting edge and the standards haven't been developed yet. We have 4 instructors. I'm one of them, 3 others, that's it. No TAs, no other support. We use a lot of guest lecturers who are experts in their areas. They live and breathe this topic every day, and they give the latest up-to-date treatment of the subject. Some things I talk about, but other things I let other people talk about because I've been out of it for a little bit, and so I want to make sure our students are getting the latest information. But as far as addressing the difference, in technical, we have some products that are not used, they're technically not medical devices, by the definition, so we don't have to worry about sterilization, things like that. Others, we do. So we just have a mix, but we rely on the faculty advisors to provide that expertise.
Can you tell us how you have your students document what they're doing? Do they keep regular lab notebooks that you look over? Have you ever used online lab notebooks?
No, so we don't require lab notebooks, even though these are all original ideas, and oftentimes these projects will have legs after the course. They'll either go on to provide preliminary data for a grant submission, or they will form the basis for a startup company. And so while we don't have them generate lab notebooks, all the documentation are both soft and hard copies of the controlled documents that go into the design history file. So at the very end of it, there's a design history file that is a compendium of all of the work that's been done. We also have them fill out weekly progress reports, research summaries, and executive summaries, which is sort of a little bit of a journal about how they're going through the process.
Yeah.
So they do maintain an archive of what they're doing at some level.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We still require the handwritten project notebook that's page numbered, bound, and there's a place to witness and all that. Because our industrial advisory board has told us that they've looked into electronic versions in their companies, and now this was about 2 years ago. Things may have changed by then, but by now. But they said the jury's still out in terms of some legal issues. So we just require the manual method. However, we have some computer engineering, electrical engineering projects that those students, they do their co-ops and they come back and say, hey, at my company we had an electronic notebook. So we allow them to do that with certain rules. It has to meet certain requirements. And so we kind of leave it up to the team. They have to document this. They need a notebook, but it's up to them whether they do it electronically or they do it manually.
Right. I do understand that several universities have used resources that are electronic laboratory notebooks that do hold up, but I think University of Wisconsin is one of them. Caltech, I think, uses the same one. As far as management, how do you pair students in your projects?
My colleague Kelly actually does that. So we have also, at the very beginning of the class, we have sort of an investor's pitch. I stand up, so if we, we might have 20 different project ideas. Each project gets one PowerPoint slide with as little text as possible. Again, we want to introduce what the problem is and not what the potential solutions are.
Right.
So we ask the students to identify their top 5, and our goal is to give them one of their top 3 picks for projects. So we take the survey of the projects that they want. We also ask them to fill out a questionnaire about whether they would like to be a team leader, what their skills are, what they're good at, and what they would like to be good at, whether they have a background in electronics or in materials, or they can drive the CAD machine. And then we put the teams together, so the technical requirements, if it's a sensor-based device and it requires instrumentation, we'll look for somebody that has some electronics background. So we use both their desired project as well as a survey on their skills and desires to formulate the teams, and we try to give everybody at least no worse than their top 3 choice.
Yeah, and we ask students to list their top 8 choices. We also ask them to tell us, what makes you qualified for this particular team, if there's some skill, if they're proficient in CAD or SolidWorks or something like that. And we try to create teams. We don't allow any more than 5 because we don't want to invite hitchhikers and loafers, and no less than 3 to 5 students per team. We have a very big co-op program, so we have to make sure that in the second semester half the team doesn't go on co-op, or leaving a big hole in the team.
Right.
So that's how we connect. We try to look at what's required expertise-wise for the project and make sure that we get students that will meet those needs.
Do you permit student-initiated projects?
Yeah, I do, as long as I have to screen them out, make sure that there's adequate design content. Excuse me, and I have a grant that I can use to fund these projects. So yeah, we do allow them. In fact, I encourage them, because I'd rather have students come up with their own ideas, identify their own problems, and identify opportunities, for a new product. The corporate sponsored projects are nice, but they do shortcut that phase. We're giving them a list of problems, and they pick that. And when they're working in industry, that does happen a lot. They're assigned a project, but a lot of times they're going to be asked to find the help with the marketing people, figure out what's our next product going to be. So they need to learn how to kind of, get out there, talk to people, identify what the problems, see what the unmet needs are, and identify some opportunities. So we do encourage those. We only get 2 or 3 of those a year.
Right.
And we don't, Don. So at the University of Utah, we do not take corporate projects or projects that the students submit. And the reason is because we want the students to be associated with a clinic and a mentor up the university hospital. And that allows them to go up and shadow physicians or take a look at the clinical environment. And we have plenty of docs who, they all know what the problems are, but they have no idea how to come up with solutions. And we have plenty of students who are itching to come up with solutions but have no idea what the problems are.
Okay, that's good. One of the questions is with FMEA and risk analysis, what's a good time to give those kinds of assignments to your students?
Yeah, I think it's it's sort of a just-in-time learning environment, because you've got to organize your lectures so that you're providing them with the news that they can use just before they need to use it. We introduce risk analysis, FMEA, fault tree analysis. We introduce that about halfway through the first semester, because we believe that it's important for them to understand what the potential risks are early in the design process, so that they can use a risk management perspective throughout the entire design process.
Yeah, we introduced the topic at the beginning of the second semester because at that point they proposed a concept. It's not finalized yet, but they proposed it, and they really, I think they need to kind of have an idea what the design is like or could be before they apply this method. And so what I do is talk to them about risk assessment, risk management for about 15 minutes, show them an FMEA example, and then I show them a product that I worked on when I worked at Milestone Scientific, it's a dental anesthesia pump, and I explain how it works and have them break up into groups, so it's an active learning exercise for the rest of the hour, and ask them to come up with a list of 3 to 5 things that could go wrong with this, and if they did go wrong, how severe would it be? Would it kill a patient? Would it just make an annoying sound? And then what the probability is, and I provide some test data and some field data that we got from customers so they can at least come up with an educated guess at the probability. Then they multiply those, get the risk, and then come up with a risk mitigation plan. Do they need to worry about it at all? Do they make a design change, a procedure change, a labeling change, that kind of thing? So in an hour, it's an active exercise to help them kind of learn what's involved in the risk management process. But I wouldn't want to do it later because then the design could get too far into the semester where they haven't really looked at risk yet. So that's when we do it, at the beginning of the second semester.
I see. Okay, now our final question here is, do you have any recommendations for texts that can be used for teaching design control or any other sorts of textbook resources?
Unfortunately, no.
Go ahead.
From my perspective, there aren't a lot. There are a couple that are out there, but we don't find that they're very effective. The guidance document from the FDA is probably about as good as you're going to get.
Yeah, I was going to say, I have some books. They're not textbooks. I don't think you need a textbook. I think you can teach these concepts and they can learn about the standards and design controls without necessarily a textbook. But I agree with Bob. When I first started presenting this information, a lot of the information I got was from FDA guidance documents. Plus, there's a magazine called MDDI, and if you go to MDDI online, they have also, it's the trade journal for the medical device industry. They have lots of articles. Almost every month they have some article related to design controls or regulatory issues. And they have some publications that do a great job of summarizing all the different phases, all the different requirements of design control. And they're documents that could be read in probably a few weeks. It's not a whole textbook. It's a lot less expensive. You could probably download them for some of these for free. So that's another resource. But I have not found, we've never used a textbook. I don't think you necessarily need an entire textbook for this topic. Because keep in mind, we're not trying to make them experts in standards and regulatory issues. We want to create an awareness so they know what they're going to have to deal with and what they're going to have to comply with when they get out into the real world.
Okay, well, that's wonderful. I want to end this by thanking you, Jay and Bob, for presenting such wonderful talks. And to all the participants who have been here, we've received about 25 questions, which is extraordinary. I'd like to ask all of the participants to stay online, and there will be a short questionnaire that follows. So thank everyone for their activity today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.